Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Schweitzer. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to give a quick shout out, as normal, to our fantastic partners, The History List and Might and Fury World War II. The holidays right around the corner. Many of us are looking to get that special person something they need. And if that someone special is anything like me, you probably struggled to find gifts that suit their hobbies and interests. But the fine folks over at the History List have you covered, from a wide range of gifts and apparel covering a wider range of not just World War II history, but also American history. There's something for all history-loving people. So go grab yourself a shirt, a metal sign, a replication document, or better yet, find an event on their site and surprise that special someone with an experience that they will truly love. For our gamers and educators, make sure you go check out the Startup, an up-and-coming game, Might and Fury World War II. I've had a fantastic opportunity to hear some of the behind-the-scenes work on this, and just from the upcoming launch audio I've listened to, I can almost promise you that the team has the best interest of the subject at heart. So go nerd out and show the entire world that you love and are dedicated to our heritage and past. Now that all that's wrapped up, let's get to the episode, shall we? On today's episode, it's going to be a long one for sure. We're covering the life, career, and legacy of Nazi Germany's Master Interrogator, Hanns Scharff. Hans Joachim Gottlob Scharff was born on December 16, 1907, in Rastenburg, East Prussia, to a Prussian army officer, Hans, but just with one N, Hermann, and Elise Sharff, with one F. Not only was Hans a Prussian army officer, brought the family into a higher caste of German society, Else was the daughter of Christian John, who was at the time one of the wealthiest and most powerful textile manufacturers in Europe. Prior to the explosion that was World War I, Hans left his commission in the Prussian army to move his family to Leipzig so he would work for his father-in-law at this giant textile factory. The whole reason behind this was his goal was to eventually take over the family business. He was the male. Else did not have any siblings. So, it would basically be the husband of his daughter would be the one that would take over the family business. And that's exactly what Hanns Scharff did, was he moved his family to Leipzig in order to take over the family business. However, as we all know, Imperial Germany, which is what it was at the time, and the rest of Europe would be dragged into one of the bloodiest battles that the world has ever, or bloodiest wars, my apologies, that the world has ever seen, and that was World War One. It was the war of many firsts, and that's not just a play on the name. Machine guns, or I guess I should say belt-fed machine gun types, linked machine guns, gas, tanks, aircraft. The World War One was a machine of death, and Imperial Germany would be brought into it. And with that, Hans would immediately go back to his position within the Prussian army, where he would be sent to fight against the French. So his family would stay in Leipzig on this massive family villa right across the street from this textile factory. And even with her father now away at war, the three sons that Hans and Else would continue, that they would have, I forgot to bring them up. So outside of Hans, not Junior, but the one that we're going to be focusing on, he had two older brothers. Or he had an older brother and then a younger brother. So these three boys, while their father was away at war, they would continue to learn the ropes of the family business. They would, in a way, kind of step up. The middle son, who is Hans, became intensely devoted to art and would fall in love with all aspects of artistic creation. However, tragedy would give the family an incredible blow. In July of 1916, Hans Hermann Scharff was leading men on the Western Front when he would be mortally wounded. While he did not die on the battlefield, Hans would only survive his injuries for a few months before succumbing to his wounds in early 1917. Just like that, the age of 9, Hans and his two brothers would lose their father in the first of two wars that would engulf and encompass their family. The death of their father not only shifted the family dynamic, but it also dramatically reshaped the future of the family. Instead, the plan that the father would take over the factory, it was now assumed that the eldest son, Eberhard, would be the one to take the family business from the grandfather. This did not mean, however, that the other two boys would not learn as well. If there was anything that the family had learned during this time, it was that they could not count on certainties for their future. This would ring true again when the youngest of the three brothers, Wolfgang, would tragically die in his teens during the 1920s. So while his eldest brother was learning the executive ins and outs of the business, if you will, Hans, who is still in his teen years, was approached by his grandfather to learn the trades of textiles and weaving. He would spend the next 3 years not only learning these trades, perfected them. He would then go on and learn the logistical side of the business, such as how to market, design, import, export, you name it. He was on that side of business. So now this is where we're going to see a massive detour of what we would usually see from an eventually high-profile Nazi, right? Not that Hans was a practitioner of the National Socialist Party. He was a very valued piece, and we're going to get to that. But not only that, his father was considered a war hero from the First World War, receiving the Iron Cross for bravery. So there is zero question on if Sharff loved his country, right? Even after his father died, he was very, he thought of his father very high because of the bravery that he had acted upon in the First World War. He received quite a few more awards for bravery, but I know the Iron Cross was the biggest one that stuck out. And even he would write in his memoir about how proud he was of his father. However, he also loved working. And instead of staying within Germany during the interwar period, he would leave Germany for South Africa. He makes the decision around 1925 to leave the family business and accept a job with Adler Automobiles in Frankfurt. And to deepen his sales acumen, he would take a position with the company in Johannesburg, South Africa, where he would basically spend the entire time up until the Second World War in South Africa. And this was because he would get an eventual promotion to the director of the overseas division for Adler. So, to put this into perspective, he was not living in Germany during the Nazis' rise to power. He did not have the experience of the internal turmoil that was taking place throughout the 1930s, although he was hearing about it, obviously. And leading up to the invasion of Poland in 1939, he really didn't have an idea. Like, he knew just because of the news that he was receiving, but as far as an influence upon him by the Nazi Party, that was a far stretch. Um, not only did he live in South Africa and make a career there, he would also end up meeting, falling in love, and marrying a South African named Margaret Stokes. Funny enough, Margaret Stokes, who is British South African, her father was a World War I ace for the British. Okay, so that's going to be interesting as this story kind of goes on. And this is one area, honestly, that I find so interesting about Hans. Yes, he was a born German with high nobility due to his father and his grandfather. He went to luxurious schools, learned art, right? Was in these, very liberal arts centric schools. And he wanted to put his path on taking over the family business. He was an individual that when he found a craft he genuinely loved, he would take it to the extreme. For him, the role in South Africa would just kind of be a stepping stone for him. I mean, to become the director of overseas operations for global companies in your 20s is kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. He also, like we said, is married to a British South African. So, where in the world, or better yet, what in the world caused Hans to go back to Germany during World War II if at no point he had not shown any fanaticism regarding the National Socialist Party? Well, boys and girls, we have something called chance on the table. While Hans was, in fact, not living in Germany during the 30s, he and his family would often take trips back to Germany for personal reasons, right? To go on vacation or holiday or to go see family, right? In the summer of 1939, Hans, Margaret, and their now two children traveled to Greece, Germany. As we all know, summer of 1939 would be, in fact, the official beginning of the Second World War. While in Greece, the Nazis would launch their surprise invasion on Poland on September 1st. All borders in Germany would be locked down, leaving the young Sharff family stranded in the middle of a war. Now, this was not an, oh no, let's scatter, let's figure out a way to get back to South Africa. They were really locked into Germany. There was no way out for them. And especially with Hans being an ethnically born German at only 31 years of age, they weren't going to let him out of the country. He eventually moved his family permanently to Berlin after finding work there, but this would only be temporary, right? And by 1942, Germany was bleeding through their youngest generation of fighters. Operation Barbarossa had proved to be an immense bloodbath, and the Wehrmacht had to replace the men that were being killed. While Hans continued to work away in Berlin, he would receive a notification that he had been drafted into the Wehrmacht. He was told to report immediately to the local train station for training in Potsdam, and then he would be directed to the Eastern Front. That's imperative to understand what happens next, right? Hanns Scharff would, in fact, be drafted. He did not fight it. He would go to training in Potsdam, where he was trained to be a part of a Panzer Grenadier in a Panzer Division. He was allocated to the Eastern Front, where men were dying in numbers never seen before. The people of Nazi Germany were not blind to the fact that hundreds of thousands and soon to be millions of men were being slaughtered in the East. The general theory here would probably be that Hans would be forced, no matter what, to go fight the Soviet Union. While there were obviously favors being played all throughout Nazi Germany, Hans simply was not a part of these groups that would be spared wartime service. However, there was one thing that Hans had up his sleeve that would potentially save his life. That's the fact that he could speak English. And not just like conversationally, he was almost a native speaker of it. The decade that he had spent working in South Africa widened his dialect of British South African. Hans had to pick up the language to be successful. Yet, Hans did not really utilize this information in order to get a pass from fighting on the Eastern Front. Funny enough, it was his wife Margaret who went basically door to door within the Wehrmacht, trying to figure out a way that she could get her husband out of going to the Eastern Front. It was only when she brought up how proficient he was in English and that a talent as high as this should not be wasted against the Soviet Union. So by this point, Margaret's able to get in front of an army general in Berlin, and Hans is already attached to this panzer element and is preparing for his deployment on the Eastern Front. They are getting ready to go to war. The very morning that he is scheduled to depart to the east, the unit receives a telegram from the top of the Wehrmacht with immediate attention to transferring Hanns Scharff, and is transferred back to Wiesbaden to join the Dolmetscher Company 12. That's interpreters. So his panzer unit heads east, and Hans heads back west into Germany. But as he would arrive in Wiesbaden, he would fall victim to some pretty standard military tomfoolery. And for those of the listeners out there that have ever served in any military or have been married to someone in the military, you know exactly what I mean by that. Once he got to Wiesbaden, he had no idea where his interpreter company was located. And when he went to the place to ask, they just attached him back to a panzer unit that was scheduled to head east to the Soviet Union. Even though he was fighting it, they were basically like, no. They refused his release to go to this battalion. Remember, he's already trained. To them, that's fantastic. That's great news. So he's just a body ready to rock. So as he's trying to get out of this, the army's just like, too bad, so sad. Or this command in this Panzer division is just like that. Unfortunate for you. Hans, however, couldn't give up, and he had one more secret piece of information that would aid him. And so before his father was killed in the First World War, he wrote a letter to all three of his sons. And in this letter, he gives them explicit instructions that if they are ever in any trouble or need help, that they are to contact Majors Lebeter and Postal. Now, both of these men were incredibly close confidants and friends of Hans's father. And they had all made a promise to each other that they would be there for their families if something were to ever happen to them. And in a last-ditch effort, a letter went out to Major Postal, informing him of the situation. Abiding by his pact that he had made with his father, Postal took on the challenge of getting him released, contacting a friend who happened to be the commanding general of the panzer unit that he was currently stuck in. The very next morning, Sharff would be released and granted the opportunity to go join the company he was sent to in Wiesbaden for. He would be sent to the city of Mainz, where he would learn the ins and outs of the British military complex, their customs, their traditions. Basically, he would learn everything about the British military and how the organization itself works. Once he completed his training on the British, he was sent directly back to headquarters in Wiesbaden, where he would more or less not do what he was trained for. He would be punching holes in paper. And after a while, he would make a pretty sly remark about the job and the costs that they should be saving. And this pissed off the general in charge. It did not make him happy at all. And he said that he did not need an enlisted man figuring out the cost of the army. And so it was at this exact point where Hans would give a detailed account of his life story up to this point and why he was able to figure out the cost so quickly, right? He had learned business from his grandfather. This was natural to him to think this way. The general would ultimately be basically enthralled of the fact that he could speak English and why he could speak English. And he would send Hans for one of three spots to attend an annual Luftwaffe interrogator school in Brussels, which would give him the experience to work as an interpreter directly with interrogators of shot down Allied airmen. It was here at this center where Hans would learn the art of interrogation from watching his peers work through each and every single Allied airman. The mighty 8th Air Force of the United States Army Air Forces began pounding mainland Europe. The volume of planes being shot down skyrocketed, and more American airmen were being brought into the center. Due to the increase of the volume of people, Hans would be separated from his British crews that he was working on and was attached to the interrogators for the U.S. Army Air Forces. Specifically, he would interpret for two men, Wayland and Schroeder. It's obviously their last names. And Hans would spend a very large amount of time working directly with these two men, sitting in on interrogations and interpreting for them. And what's great is they thought highly of him. They thought his skills were impeccable, and ultimately asked for him to become their permanent interpreter, and which was granted. However, while on vacation in the fall of 1943, Schroeder and Wayland were involved in an aircraft incident that would kill Schroeder and mortally wound Wayland. Now, with the two leading interrogators of the American crews now either dead or dying, the decision was officially made to make Hans the new interrogator of the U.S. Army Air Forces. And now is a great time to pause because Hans will ultimately change the course of the art behind interrogation forever once he's in his new position. But what were Nazi Germany's techniques prior to his ascension, if you will? Punishment and pain is the best way to describe it. In previous tactics, the interrogators would use fear, physical violence, and in many cases, things such as starvation. And while these tactics are valuable, it can also lead the one being questioned to become so frightened that they basically become incapable of communicating correctly. This was incredibly dark and dirty work to do in order to get info needed from a prisoner, right? But Hans, on the other hand, viewed the prisoner's situation quite a bit differently, and instead of becoming the one to fear, he placed himself in the shoes as an advocate for the prisoner. For Hans, he utilized the reputation of the infamous Gestapo in order to strike fear into the prisoners, but also let them rely heavily on his trust, right? So for him, he would let them know that if they were unable to identify the airmen, then the Luftwaffe would have no choice than to consider them or deem them a spy and then hand them over to the Gestapo for further interrogation and would not be allowed back into the POW camp. For a downed American airman, this is scary as shit, and this is about as deep as it goes. The Gestapo has an incredibly devilish persona around them, right? They are murderers. Kristallnacht was put forth by the Gestapo. Heinrich Himmler led the Gestapo. They are the bruiser, if you will, for Nazi Germany. So if you're a downed American airman falling into the hands of the Gestapo or being handed over to them, it definitely increases your chance that you're not going to make it back home. So by providing a sense of protection around them from the Gestapo, the airmen would begin to rely heavily on Hans as a safety net to ensure nothing would ever happen to them. Hans began to quickly use this position of safety in a way to befriend the prisoners. In one specific instance, famous American ace Francis Gabreski would crash land on a strafing run, and he would ultimately be captured by the Germans. When Gabreski reached Sharff's office, Sharff pointed out a picture and a news clipping that was on his wall of Gabreski, letting him know that he has been anticipating and was very excited to meet Gabreski. Instantly a relief to Gabreski that he was not going to be physically harmed, he would become friends with Hans, even though Hans was never able to get useful information from him. Even in Gabreski's silence, Scharff would be kind by bringing him beers or home-cooked meals from his wife. This friendship came deep enough that both Gabreski and Scharff would not only stay in contact after the war, but they would remain friends for the remainder of their life. Hans also utilized the fact that his wife was an Englishwoman, and that his father-in-law was an esteemed British World War One fighter pilot. And by admitting these pieces of his personal life and the direct connection to their own way of life, the airmen were relaxed. And Gabreski was not the only individual that he did special things for, right? So for a huge amount of his prisoners, he would often bring those home cooked meals into the men. He would bring them beers and share a drink with them. He would share jokes and tell personal stories with these men. And in many cases, he would bring them to events such as those at airfields, so they would receive some form of entertainment. They would receive heightened medical care, where they would actually go into the city to go to a public hospital. And even in one instance, he let a prisoner who was a pilot get into a plane and fly it. And pilot came back. In Scharff's eyes, he knew the best way possible to get information that was truthful and useful would be to make the men vulnerable by a false sense of safety. At the end of the day, the prisoners were still just that. They were captured in war by their enemy. This was not a good thing, and death was still a very real fear. However, by generating truth and providing a comfortable lifestyle for them, the prisoners would do whatever it took to stay in that blanket of protection and freedoms. One technique that Scharff began using heavily would be to take prisoners one on one into the woods for a conversation. Only Scharff would never ask any direct questions about one's military past. He would just allow the prisoners to speak freely and about anything that they wanted to. By doing so, so many of them would have what we call word vomit, right? And openly, without realizing it, give Scharff valuable information. Was always perceived as he knew everything already. So what was the harm in telling him, right? In the instance for Gabreski that we spoke of earlier, he had a picture and news clippings from a newspaper on his wall, like nailed to his wall in a frame. And Hanns was basically letting Gabreski know, I already know who you are. And while it did not work on Gabreski specifically, it worked on hundreds of other airmen that he interrogated. The Sharff technique had officially been created, and if we take all that you've learned about his interrogation style, it is that first you must befriend them and gain trust of the individual, and then allow them to tell you the information. In one infamous example of this, Scharff explained that he knew about the American chemical shortage, and it made sense that the tracers attached to the rounds would burn off white instead of red. It's cheaper to make white. You don't have to use a dye. Then this airman that he was interrogating actually corrected him as saying that it was a myth and a lie, and the real reason they have white ones now is to let the shooter know that they are almost out of ammunition. And just like that, by making a simple comment, a prisoner openly divulged critical information about the functionality of their weapon systems. Information like this was not forced, but it was just given. And in many cases, he would invite prisoners on walks through the woods, like I stated earlier, and the only thing he would promise them is just don't escape. Not do not attempt to escape, it was don't escape. He was basically telling them he wasn't going to chase them down or shoot them or yell for help. He was just, I'm giving you trust, you give me trust. And he never had anyone escape. In many of these walks, the airmen would simply just give away too much information. And throughout all of World War II, Scharff would interrogate over 500 American airmen. And out of those 500, he openly admitted that 12 never divulged information that he deemed useful. One of those individuals, obviously, being Gabreski. And once the war ended, he was, in a way, allowed to just return back to his normal life. Since he was not a war criminal and never abused his prisoners, he was never brought to war crime trials, and there were no crimes charged against him. In actuality, Hanns Scharff was highly sought after. And in 1948, when the United States requested him to come serve as an expert in regards to the trials of famed American defector Martin Monty, he went and then he stayed to testify at the trial. It was during his time in the United States that he fell in love with the country, and eventually he immigrated and became a citizen. While many organizations such as the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the United States Air Force, the United States Army, the Royal Military, and many others would seek insights, teachings, and lectures of his interrogation techniques throughout the remainder of his life. However, it was never really his passion. He was simply just great at it. For Scharff, his heart had always belonged to art. From the time he was a child in Leipzig learning about art and design, he had absolutely fallen in love with the process and act of making art. Along with his daughter-in-law, Monica Sharff, they opened Sharff and Scharff in Los Angeles, California, where they would specifically work on mosaics. Sharff and Scharff is still around today, and their portfolio of mosaics is absolutely stunning. For those of you that do not know this, Hanns Scharff designed, made, and painted the large mosaics of the Cinderella Castle at Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. A man who had once interrogated hundreds of American prisoners in war was now living in the land they came from, painting in peace. Hanns Scharff would pass away at the age of 84 on September 10th, 1992, at his home in Bear Valley Springs, California. In 2009, after the Abu Ghraib prisoner torture and abuse scandal, the high-valued interrogation group was established to further understand Scharff's techniques and how the United States can utilize it as their main practice moving forward. This was approved, and since then, the HVI group has interrogated thousands of federal prisoners using Scharff's techniques. In all, he forever changed the way interrogating your enemy is practiced. He proved that you did not need to beat your prisoners into submission in order for them to cooperate. You can actually do the exact opposite. And the legacy of Hanns Scharff should be remembered for his humanity towards the enemy and how the soldiers of countries who are enemies do not need to be enemies themselves. I had an absolutely fantastic and wild time researching and working on this episode. The amount of information about Hanns Scharff is out there, but it's pretty limited or repetitive, if you will. But this story is incredible to me. He was a man that went from, you know, almost in a way, he was, a part of a top wealthy family. Father was a Prussian military officer that was killed in the First World War. His grandfather owned a large textile factory and was very wealthy. And he was very well educated. He was very skilled, and it still put him in the middle of this war. And he utilized humanity for good. So Hanns definitely needs to be remembered for that, and the things that he's done for the world since then. As always, thank you all so much for everything you do. Thank you to our partners again, the History List and Might and Fury World War II, for your support to grow our community. In our next episode, we're going to cover my personal favorite theater of operations in World War II, and more specifically, the one that I focused my research on in graduate school, the Pacific. More importantly, we're going to cover one of the most controversial and deadliest battles in the Pacific, and that is the Battle of Peleliu. This is going to be a two-parter. The first episode will cover the why, the who's, and the whens behind the operation, right? Everything leading up to it, and kind of some of the controversy around it. And then that second episode, we're going to start with the landing at Peleliu. Some personal stories. Obviously, I'm going to bring in one of my favorite books of all time, With the Old Breed, with Eugene Sledge. It's a fantastic book. I'm going to bring in some of his memoir into the episode. So definitely make sure you guys check that out when it comes out. So make sure you leave us a rate and a review wherever you listen to this podcast. Follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, Patreon, and Discord by searching World on Fire Podcast. Thank you all so much again for everything you do, and I will see you all in 2 weeks.